Out in the deserts of northern Sudan, there are more pyramids than in all of Egypt, more than 200 of them. And most people have never heard of the kingdom that built them, far up the Nile, well to the south of the pharaohs. This was an African empire that pulled off something almost no one else ever managed. It conquered Egypt and ruled it as pharaohs. Hundreds of years later, it went to war with Rome and fought the Romans to a standstill. For most of its life, it stood as Egypt's equal. It had a written language of its own, in a script of its own, and even now no one can read it. The letters are still there on the stone. We just can't hear what they say. Twice this kingdom was very nearly wiped from the record, once by the enemies who defeated it, and once far later by people who simply would not believe an empire like it had ever stood in Africa. Their name was Kush. For 1,000 years they were one of the powers of the ancient world, and then they slipped almost entirely out of human memory. To understand how, we have to go south, up the Nile, to where the story starts. Their home was Nubia on the upper Nile in what is now Sudan. The ancient world prized it above all for its gold. For century after century, Nubia lived as Egypt's neighbor to the south, sometimes a trading partner, sometimes a province under Egyptian rule. At the heart of the kingdom rose a flat-topped holy mountain, Jebel Barkal. The Kushites believed the Egyptian god Amun lived inside it, and over time their kings came to see themselves as Amun's chosen, the true heirs of Egypt. Then Egypt came apart. The land of the pharaohs broke into rival statelets, and the throne was squabbled over by small-time princes in the northern delta. There was no longer any single pharaoh at all. The kings of Kush had been watching from the south, and they moved. A king named Kashta reached up into southern Egypt and took the holy city of Thebes, and he took it without a battle. Its priests simply accepted him as their rightful ruler. It was his successor, Piye, who took everything else. Around 728 BCE, he marched north against a coalition of Egyptian princes, calling it a holy war for Amun, less a conquest, he said, than a rescue of Egypt's own gods. Egypt fell to him city by city. Piye took Memphis, the ancient capital, and accepted the surrender of every rival in turn, until one king ruled the entire length of the Nile, from deep inside Sudan all the way to the sea. And then Piye did the last thing you'd expect a conqueror to do. He went home. He sailed back up the river to his own capital at Napata and left Egypt behind him. What he had founded, we call the 25th Dynasty. The kings of Kush were pharaohs of Egypt now. They wore the old double crown of the pharaohs, but with two cobras at the brow instead of one, and a small ram's head of Amun at the throat. Egyptian and unmistakably Kushite at the same time. What came next was a golden age. Piye's brother Shabaka moved the royal court north to Memphis, inside Egypt itself, and ruled as a full Egyptian pharaoh, a man restoring the old order rather than a foreigner sitting on it. Egypt had let a lot of its old ways lapse, and the Kushite pharaohs set about bringing them back. They had ancient texts recopied, repaired temples that had been left to rot, and reached 2,000 years into Egypt's past for their models. They revived the pyramid too. Egypt itself had stopped building royal pyramids 1,000 years before, but the kings of Kush started raising them again, steeper and slimmer than the Egyptian kind, the shape of their royal tombs for the next 1,000 years. The empire hit its peak under a king called Taharqa. In his reign, Egypt and Kush together were as large as Egypt had been at its strongest centuries earlier. Taharqa built everywhere, the whole length of the river. At the great temple complex of Karnak, he put up a towering row of columns. One of them is still standing on the site today. His name carried far past his own borders. He even turns up in the Hebrew Bible as a pharaoh named Tirhakah, who marched out to face the most feared army of the age. His reign is remembered as the high water mark of the dynasty. For roughly 50 years, an African dynasty held the throne of the pharaohs and governed the Nile from the shores of the Mediterranean down into the African interior, the largest empire the valley had seen in 500 years. But a new power was rising in the east. Assyria fought with iron weapons and a fearsome name for cruelty, and its eyes were turning toward the Nile. When Assyria invaded Egypt, the Kushite pharaohs met it in the field and were beaten. Bronze weapons were simply no match for iron. The Assyrians took Memphis. Then they drove south and stormed Thebes, the holy city of Amun, and stripped it bare, a blow that sent a shock through the whole ancient world. The pharaohs of Kush were pushed out of Egypt and back down into their southern homeland. In under a century, the African dynasty had lost the Egyptian throne for good. Egypt would never again be ruled from the south. Egypt's new masters then tried to erase them outright, scratching the Kushite kings' names off the monuments and chiseling away their carved faces, as though the whole dynasty could be deleted from history. But Kush survived. The kingdom pulled back to the south and, over the years, shifted its capital further up the Nile to Meroë, a city on green grassland in the fork of two rivers. There it began again, more on its own terms this time. Alongside Amun, the Kushites raised up a new god who was theirs alone, Apedemak, with the head of a lion. And they started writing in their own script and their own tongue. And at Meroë, the rulers were often women, the kandakes, warrior queens who ran the kingdom and led its armies, in an age when almost nowhere else gave women that power. When Rome took Egypt and pushed south for tribute, a queen answered. Her name was Amanirenas, and by some accounts she had lost an eye in battle. Around 25 BCE, she led an army of tens of thousands straight at Rome. Her soldiers overran the Roman towns along the border and carried the plunder home, including the bronze head of a statue of the Emperor Augustus, sliced clean off at the neck. Amanirenas had the head buried face down under the steps of a temple, so that every worshiper who walked inside would tread on the Emperor of Rome. The insult was deliberate, and it held. The war dragged on, and Rome could not break her. In the end, it was Rome that settled, making peace on her terms, pulling its frontier back and dropping the tribute. A small African kingdom had taken on Rome and come out ahead. Meroë carried on for 3 more centuries, but it was slowly fading. The trade routes shifted to the Red Sea and passed it by, and the land around the city was wearing out, its trees cut down and fed into the iron furnaces. Around 350 CE, an army from the rising kingdom of Aksum came down the river and sacked Meroë. After more than 1,000 years, Kush was finished. The cities fell silent, and the kings were forgotten. But the desert kept what the conquerors could never haul away. Stone outlasts memory. Out in the Sudanese desert, more than 200 pyramids are still standing, steeper and narrower than the ones in Egypt, raised over nearly 1,000 years for kings, queens, and nobles alike. And on the temple walls, that lost language is still waiting. Scholars can sound the letters of the Meroitic script out loud, but they still can't read the words. A whole civilization is trying to tell us something, and we can't quite make it out. For a long time, Kush was filed away as a footnote to Egypt. Its work doubted, its treasures explained away, its very existence half forgotten by people who couldn't picture an empire like this one rising in Africa. But the proof is still out there in the sand. This was no imitation of Egypt. It wore the double crown, it outlived the pharaohs who came before it, and it took on Rome and won. And the people never went anywhere. The Nubians still live along the Nile today, on both sides of the old line between Egypt and Sudan, the descendants of the kings who once ruled 2 lands. Kush conquered Egypt and humbled Rome, and the world forgot it anyway. But its monuments outlasted its enemies, and its people outlasted them both. Thrones, in the end, are the most fragile thing an empire builds. Empires fall, people remain.